When 9-year-old Evan ran crying to ex-gang members for help, they discovered his father had been secretly fighting municipal corruption while helping desperate families. What they found in his hidden documentation would expose a $1 million fraud and transform an entire community, like if you believe in standing up for justice. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary heroes creating extraordinary change, and comment where you're watching from. When 9-year-old Evan ran crying to ex-gang members for help, they discovered his father had been secretly fighting municipal corruption while helping desperate families. What they found in his hidden documentation would expose a $1 million fraud and transform an entire community, like if you believe in standing up for justice. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary heroes creating extraordinary change, and comment where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the community workshop's windows when 9-year-old Evan Hale burst through the front door, his small chest heaving with panic and tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. His Superman backpack hung askew from one shoulder, and his untied shoelaces clicked against the concrete floor as he stumbled toward the 3 men working on various projects around the space. Please, you have to come with me," Evan gasped between sobs, his voice carrying the desperate pitch that only comes from a child who has witnessed something beyond his understanding. "Something's wrong at my house. Mom's scared and there are people. Strangers." Jericho Salinas looked up from the motorcycle engine he'd been rebuilding, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for a shop rag to clean the grease before kneeling down to Evan's eye level. The boy's panic triggered memories of his own childhood terror, and his voice carried the gentle authority of someone who understood fear. "Easy, buddy. Take a deep breath," Jericho said softly, placing a steady hand on Evan's trembling shoulder. "Tell us what happened." Cole Merritt abandoned his paperwork at the front desk, his counselor training kicking in as he assessed the child's distress. Mateo Rodriguez emerged from the supply room, basketball still in hand from the afternoon youth program, his expression shifting from casual to concerned as he took in the scene. Evan's words tumbled out in a rush of childhood panic and confusion. Mom came home from her sewing job and started crying. "There's men in our house with papers, and they're moving our stuff around, and one of them was mean to her, and she told me to run and find help. But I didn't know where to go, except here because you guys always say if kids need help." The 3 men exchanged glances that communicated volumes about shared experiences with authority figures who brought fear instead of safety. Without discussion, they began moving toward the door, Jericho grabbing his jacket while Cole locked the cash register and Mateo tossed the basketball into a corner bin. "You did exactly right coming here," Cole assured Evan, his voice carrying the calm confidence that made him effective with troubled youth. "We're going to walk with you and make sure everything's okay." The 6-block journey to the Hale house felt longer than it should have, Evan's small legs working to keep pace with the men's longer strides, while he continued his anxious chatter about his mother's tears and the stranger's official-looking clipboards. His backpack bounced with each hurried step, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if checking that his unlikely protectors were still following. "Is Mom in trouble?" Evan asked, his voice small and frightened as they turned onto his familiar street. "The man said something about papers not being right, and money owed, and I didn't understand, but Mom looked so scared." Jericho's jaw tightened slightly, his experience having taught him to be suspicious of official visits that left children running for help. "We'll figure it out, kiddo. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that seem scarier than they really are." As they approached the small yellow house with its carefully tended front garden, they could see through the open door that Evan's description had been accurate. Men in pressed shirts moved through the living room with practiced efficiency, while a woman's voice, presumably Maribel's, could be heard answering questions with the strained politeness of someone trying to remain cooperative despite obvious distress. "That's my house," Evan whispered, suddenly shy about leading 3 large men to his front door. "Mom's probably in the kitchen. She always goes to the kitchen when she's worried." The scene that greeted them confirmed Evan's worst fears and validated his instinct to seek help. Maribel Hale sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by documents she clearly didn't understand, while 2 men with clipboards and official badges explained something about discrepancies and investigations in voices that carried bureaucratic authority but little human warmth. "Mom!" Evan called out, rushing to her side with the desperate relief of a child who had successfully brought help to solve a problem too big for him to handle alone. Maribel's eyes widened as she saw her son followed by 3 men she recognized from community events but had never spoken to directly. Her face showed the complex mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that comes from needing help from unexpected sources during a family crisis. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaky but trying to maintain dignity. Evan shouldn't have bothered you. This is just a misunderstanding about some paperwork. No bother at all. Ma'am, Jericho said, his tone respectful but firm as he surveyed the scene. Evan did exactly what he should do when his family needs help. The two officials looked up from their documents with the mild annoyance of people who were accustomed to conducting their business without interference. One of them, a thin man with steel-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat in a way that suggested the presence of additional witnesses was unwelcome. This is a private matter involving municipal records and tax assessments, the man said, his voice carrying the dismissive authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. There's no need for community involvement. Mateo stepped closer to the table, his presence quiet but unmistakably protective. With respect, when a child comes running for help because his mother is upset, that becomes community business. As tensions began to crystallize around the kitchen table, Evan pulled something from his backpack with the careful movements of a child handling a precious discovery. It was an old brass keychain with the number 47 engraved into its surface, the metal worn smooth by years of handling. I found this when I came home from school, Evan said, holding the keychain out toward his mother. It was on the floor by the front door. Is it important? The men came right after I showed it to you. Maribel's reaction to seeing the keychain again was immediate and telling. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, and Jericho noticed how her eyes filled with tears that seemed to carry more than simple fear. They held recognition, memory, and the weight of secrets suddenly becoming relevant. Chapter 2. Maribel's fingers closed around the brass keychain with the reverent care of someone handling a message from beyond the grave. The kitchen had grown quiet, except for the nervous shuffling of official paperwork and Evan's anxious breathing as he pressed closer to his mother's side, seeking comfort in her familiar warmth. This belonged to your father, Maribel whispered to Evan, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the wall clock that had belonged to her grandmother. I haven't seen it since before he died. The two officials exchanged glances that suggested this revelation was neither surprising nor welcome. The thin man with steel-rimmed glasses consulted his clipboard with renewed urgency, while his partner began gathering documents with the efficient movements of someone preparing to leave quickly. Mrs. Hale, if you could just sign these acknowledgement forms, we can conclude our assessment for today, the first official said, his tone carrying the false friendliness that bureaucrats use when they want compliance without questions. Jericho studied the keychain with growing recognition, his memory reaching back to codes and symbols from a life he'd tried to leave behind. The number 47 wasn't random. It represented something specific, a commitment that had been made years ago by people who understood that some debts could only be paid through action, not money. Evan, buddy, can you tell us exactly where you found this? Cole asked gently, kneeling beside the boy's chair. Was it just lying on the floor, or was it hidden somewhere? Evan's face scrunched with concentration as he tried to remember details that seemed important to the grown-ups around him. It was by the front door, but not like someone dropped it. More like it was waiting for me to find it, under the little rug Mom puts there. The implications settled over the kitchen like smoke from a distant fire. Roberto Hale had hidden the keychain where his son would discover it, but only during circumstances that would bring the boy home in the middle of a crisis. It was a message designed to be found at exactly this moment. By exactly these people, Mateo had been quiet during the exchange, but now he moved toward the window that overlooked the backyard, his attention caught by something that made his shoulders tense. Mrs. Hale, was your husband involved in any community projects, construction work, municipal contracts, anything involving the city? Roberto worked construction, Maribel replied, wiping tears from her eyes while keeping one protective arm around Evan. Mostly private contracts, home repairs, some small commercial jobs, but he also volunteered sometimes for city projects when they needed extra help. The officials were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The thin man stood abruptly, his clipboard clutched against his chest like a shield. Mrs. Hale, we'll need to schedule a follow-up appointment to complete our assessment. Someone from our office will contact you within the week. What kind of assessment? Jericho asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to asking questions that officials preferred not to answer. And which office exactly do you represent? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. The two men exchanged glances again, and their hesitation suggested they hadn't expected to be asked for specifics about their authority or procedures. Municipal compliance and taxation? The second official answered vaguely. Routine review of property assessments and payment histories? Cole's counseling experience had taught him to recognize when people were being less than truthful, and something about the official's explanations felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Would it be possible to see some identification, just so Mrs. Hale knows who she's been speaking with? The request produced identification badges that appeared official but didn't match the municipal formatting that someone familiar with city departments would recognize. Jericho memorized the names and badge numbers with the systematic attention of someone who had learned to document details that might become important later. After the officials departed with obvious relief, the kitchen felt larger but not necessarily safer. Evan remained close to his mother, his 9-year-old understanding of the situation limited, but his awareness of adult tension acute. "Why did Dad hide the keychain?" Evan asked, turning the brass object over in his small hands. "And why didn't those men want to answer questions?" Maribel looked around the kitchen that had been her husband's favorite room in their small house, remembering conversations about work projects and community involvement that had seemed routine at the time but now carried ominous implications. "Your father believed in helping people," she said carefully, choosing words that would give Evan age-appropriate information without frightening him further. "Sometimes helping people means getting involved in complicated situations." Jericho examined the keychain under the kitchen light, noting details that might provide clues about its significance. The number 47 was etched with professional precision, and the brass showed wear patterns that suggested regular use over many years. "Mrs. Hale, would it be possible to look through Roberto's papers?" he asked respectfully. "Sometimes when people leave messages, they also leave explanations." The search of Roberto's home office, really just a corner of the master bedroom with a small desk and filing cabinet, revealed the methodical record-keeping of someone who understood the importance of documentation. Construction invoices, permit applications, and correspondence with city departments created a paper trail that suggested Roberto's work had been more extensive and more complicated than Maribel had realized. "Look at this," Cole said, holding up a folder labeled simply, "Community Projects." Inside were contracts, payment receipts, and handwritten notes in Roberto's careful script that detailed work performed for municipal departments over the past 3 years. The amounts were significant, tens of thousands of dollars in contracted work that should have provided comfortable income for the Hale family. Yet Maribel's modest lifestyle and current financial difficulties suggested that money had gone somewhere other than household expenses. "Mom, there's another box under Dad's desk," Evan announced, his small size allowing him to crawl into spaces the adults couldn't easily access. "It's got papers and stuff in it." The box contained documentation that began to explain both the keychain and the official interest in the Hale household. Roberto had been keeping meticulous records of irregularities in municipal contracting, including photographs of unfinished projects that had been marked as completed, and invoices for materials that had never been delivered to job sites. But more than that, the box contained evidence that Roberto had been using his knowledge of municipal fraud to help community members who were struggling with bureaucratic problems that should have been resolved through official channels. "Your husband was quite a man," Jericho said softly, reviewing Roberto's careful documentation of families helped, problems solved, and assistance provided through channels that operated parallel to official social services. The keychain was beginning to make sense as something more than a simple remembrance. It was the key to understanding Roberto's role in a system of community assistance that had been operating quietly for years, helping people navigate problems that official procedures couldn't or wouldn't address. Chapter 3. The community center buzzed with quiet energy as neighbors began arriving in response to phone calls that had spread through the network like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Santos brought homemade coffee and the kind of cookies that made any gathering feel like family, while Mr. Vega arrived with his ledger book and the careful attention to detail that had made his corner store a neighborhood institution for 30 years. Evan sat cross-legged on a folding chair that was too big for him, carefully coloring in a picture book while listening to adult conversations that he didn't fully understand, but sensed were important to his family's safety. His mother sat nearby, the brass keychain resting on the table in front of her, like evidence in a case that was slowly building toward some kind of truth. "Roberto fixed our porch steps 3 summers ago," Mrs. Rodriguez shared, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose arthritis made sitting down a negotiated process. "Never asked for payment. Said he was just practicing some techniques he'd learned on a city job." Isabella Gutierrez, home from her first semester at community college, had brought her laptop and the kind of research skills that made older residents marvel at what young people could discover with internet access and determination. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as she cross-referenced Roberto's documented projects with public records of municipal contracts. According to city records, Your husband worked on 17 different projects over the past 4 years, Isabella reported, her screen displaying spreadsheets that would have impressed professional auditors. But the total value of those contracts is almost 3 times what Mrs. Hale would have needed for household expenses. Jericho had been making careful phone calls to contacts who owed him favors from previous community assistance projects. His network included people who understood both sides of law enforcement and could provide insights into municipal investigations without violating official protocols. Detective Martinez says there's been informal inquiries about contracting irregularities in several districts, he reported, keeping his voice low enough that Evan could continue coloring without overhearing details that might worry him. Nothing official yet, but enough concern to generate the kind of visits you received this morning. Cole's counseling experience had taught him to recognize when families were dealing with problems too complex for individual solutions, and the Hale situation was clearly beyond anything Maribel could resolve alone. His approach was systematic, identifying resources, building support networks, and creating action plans that protected vulnerable family members while addressing underlying issues. "We need to document everything Roberto was doing," Cole said, organizing papers into neat stacks according to project dates and locations. Not just the municipal contracts, but the community assistance, the problem-solving, the informal help he provided to neighbors. Marcus Washington, a teenager who split his time between school and helping at the community center, had noticed patterns that older residents might have missed. His youth gave him a different perspective on information that adults processed as separate incidents. Every time there was a family emergency in the neighborhood, Mr. Hale showed up within a day or two, Marcus observed, consulting notes he'd taken during conversations with various neighbors, not with money directly, but with solutions. Job opportunities, introductions to people who could help, problems that got resolved faster than they should have through official channels. The emerging picture was of Roberto as a community facilitator who had used his legitimate work with municipal departments to identify and solve problems that fell through bureaucratic cracks. Families facing eviction suddenly found rental assistance programs they hadn't known existed. Children who needed medical care were connected with doctors who provided services regardless of insurance status. Adults seeking employment discovered training programs that matched their skills with available positions. "Your father was like a bridge," Mateo explained to Evan during a break from the adult conversations. He found ways to connect people who needed help with people who could provide it, even when those connections weren't obvious. Evan looked up from his coloring book with the serious expression that children wear when they're trying to understand adult concepts. "Is that why the mean men came to our house? Because Dad was helping people?" The question carried more insight than most adults would have credited to a 9-year-old, and it highlighted the central moral complexity of the situation. Roberto's assistance to community members had been genuine and valuable, but it had operated through systems that weren't entirely legitimate. As afternoon shifted toward evening, more neighbors arrived with stories that painted a comprehensive picture of Roberto's community role. Mrs. Chen described how her daughter's medical bills had been resolved through programs she'd never heard of. The Hernandez family explained how Roberto had helped them navigate immigration paperwork that had been stalled in bureaucratic processes for months. "The pattern is clear," Isabella said, looking up from her laptop where she'd been creating a database of Roberto's documented assistance activities. He was using inside knowledge of municipal departments to help families access services they were entitled to but couldn't obtain through normal channels. But the investigation had also revealed troubling evidence of systematic fraud within municipal contracting that went far beyond Roberto's involvement. Projects that existed on paper but not in reality, materials purchased but never delivered, and payments authorized for work that was never completed, created a picture of corruption that made Roberto's community assistance look like small change in a much larger criminal enterprise. The question is whether Roberto was trying to stop the corruption or just redirect some of its benefits toward people who needed help, Jericho said, studying photographs of incomplete city projects that should have been finished months earlier. Sarah from the library arrived as the group was preparing to conclude their evening session, bringing additional documents that shifted their understanding once again. Her access to archived newspaper articles and historical records had revealed information that placed Roberto's activities in a broader context of municipal politics and community advocacy. There were complaints about contracting irregularities dating back 5 years, Sarah reported, spreading photocopied newspaper articles across the table. But the complaints disappeared from public discussion after Roberto started his community assistance work. The implications suggested that Roberto hadn't just discovered municipal fraud. He had found a way to turn that fraud into genuine community benefit, while documenting evidence that could eventually expose the entire system. The keychain with the number 47 was beginning to look less like a sentimental keepsake, and more like a key to understanding a complex plan that Roberto had been developing over several years. Chapter 4. The city records office felt like a mausoleum of bureaucratic secrets, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across metal filing cabinets and computer terminals that hummed with the persistence of machines processing endless municipal data. Cole and Isabella worked with the methodical precision of researchers who understood that truth often hid in the margins of official documents. Roberto's signature appears on change orders for 12 different projects, Isabella reported, her voice low in the reverent quiet that libraries and government offices seem to require. But look at the timing. Every change order was filed within 24 hours of a community emergency. Meanwhile, across town, Evan was experiencing his own form of investigation. 9-year-old sleep patterns don't accommodate adult crises, and his dreams had become populated by stern-faced men with clipboards, and his mother's tears echoing through their small house. When sleep finally came, it brought nightmares of losing his home and his mother's frightened voice calling his name. Bad dreams again, Maribel asked gently. Finding her son in the kitchen at dawn with the patient alertness of a child who had given up on comfortable sleep, Evan nodded, accepting the warm milk his mother offered while studying her face for signs that the scary men might return. Are we going to have to move away like Tommy's family did when his dad lost his job? The question carried the weight of childhood fears that adults often underestimate. For Evan, the stability of home, school, and neighborhood represented the entire scope of security he understood, and threats to that stability felt like threats to existence itself. We're going to figure this out, Maribel assured him, though her own confidence was still rebuilding after yesterday's discoveries. The people helping us are very good at solving complicated problems. At the community center, Marcus had appointed himself coordinator of what he called neighborhood intelligence, systematically visiting elderly residents and longtime community members who might remember details about Roberto's work that hadn't been documented in official records. Mrs. Patterson remembers Roberto asking questions about which families were struggling with utility bills, Marcus reported during the morning planning session, not asking for gossip, but trying to understand patterns of who needed help when winter heating costs went up. The investigation was revealing Roberto's community assistance as far more sophisticated than simple charity. He had been tracking social service gaps, identifying bureaucratic failures, and using his position within municipal contracting to create solutions that address systemic problems, rather than just individual crises. Jericho's contacts in law enforcement had provided information that added urgency to their research efforts. The informal inquiries about municipal contracting had become a formal investigation, and families who had received Roberto's assistance were likely to face scrutiny that could jeopardize their access to legitimate social services. We need to move faster, he advised during a strategy meeting that Evan attended while working on homework at a nearby table. If Roberto's assistance gets classified as proceeds from criminal activity, every family he helped could lose benefits they're entitled to through legal programs. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Anonymous phone calls had begun arriving at neighbors' homes, suggesting that excessive community involvement might result in unintended complications for people who had immigration status concerns or relied on government assistance programs. Mateo had been working with social services administrators who were willing to review cases informally before any official investigation began. His goal was to ensure that families who had received Roberto's help would be protected under whistleblower assistance provisions rather than penalized as unknowing recipients of fraudulent benefits. 7 families have been preemptively enrolled in legitimate assistance programs, he reported with quiet satisfaction. If questions arise about Roberto's help, they'll have documented eligibility for similar benefits through legal channels. But the deeper they dug into municipal records, the more complex Roberto's situation became. His documentation of contracting fraud was extensive and legally sound, but his method of helping families had operated in gray areas that could be interpreted as either humanitarian assistance or conspiracy to distribute fraudulent benefits. Look at this, Cole said, spreading a timeline across the community center's main table. Every time Roberto documented evidence of municipal fraud, he also provided assistance to families within the affected district. It's like he was creating a parallel system that delivered promised services even when official projects were being mismanaged. The pattern suggested that Roberto hadn't been stealing municipal funds. He had been redirecting funds that were being stolen by others, ensuring that at least some benefit reached the communities that contracting fraud was supposedly serving. Isabella's research had uncovered the most troubling evidence yet. Municipal contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had been authorized for projects that existed only on paper, with payments flowing to contractors who had performed little or no actual work. Roberto's community assistance represented a tiny fraction of the money being systematically stolen through fraudulent contracting. Roberto wasn't the criminal, she announced with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex puzzle. He was the witness. Every family he helped, every problem he solved, every service he provided was creating evidence that municipal fraud was depriving communities of promised infrastructure improvements. As afternoon light filtered through the community center's windows, Evan finished his homework and approached the adults who had been working so intently on problems that seemed to involve his father in ways he was beginning to understand. "Did my dad try to catch the bad guys?" he asked, with the directness that children use when adult conversations have circled around truths that seem obvious to younger minds. Jericho knelt down to Evan's eye level, recognizing that the boy deserved honest answers to questions that affected his family's future. "Your dad found out that people were stealing money that was supposed to help neighborhoods like ours. Instead of just getting mad about it, he figured out how to make sure some good things happened anyway." The explanation satisfied Evan's need to understand his father as someone who fought against unfairness. But it also highlighted the moral complexity that the adults were trying to navigate. Roberto's assistance had been genuinely helpful to community members, but it had also been technically illegal, creating legal vulnerabilities for everyone involved. Chapter 5. The transformation of Maribel's street began subtly, like the first signs of spring appearing in patches of snow. Mrs. Santos started lingering on her front porch during her morning coffee, positioning herself where she could observe any official vehicles that might approach the Hale house. Mr. Vega began walking his ancient poodle twice as often as necessary, his routes carefully planned to pass by Maribel's house during times when bureaucratic visits seemed most likely. "It's like the whole neighborhood is standing guard," Evan observed with 9-year-old wonder, watching from his bedroom window as neighbors found reasons to be visible and available throughout the day. The solidarity wasn't organized through formal meetings or posted announcements. Instead, it spread through the kind of informal communication networks that develop in communities where people have learned to look out for each other. Phone calls between friends, conversations at the corner market, and brief exchanges during school pickup times created a web of mutual awareness and support. Mrs. Rodriguez had become the unofficial coordinator of what neighbors began calling community memory. Her arthritis didn't prevent her from making systematic visits to households that had received Roberto's assistance, carefully documenting stories that might become important if official investigations began questioning the legitimacy of help that families had received in good faith. "Roberto helped my grandson get into that apprenticeship program," Mrs. Patterson shared during one of these informal interviews, her weathered hands gesturing as she spoke. Miguel had been trying to get accepted for months, but there was always some problem with his paperwork or his references. Then Roberto made some phone calls, and suddenly everything was resolved. The pattern of Roberto's assistance was becoming clearer through these neighborhood conversations. He hadn't been providing direct financial aid to families in crisis. Instead, he had been using his knowledge of municipal systems and his network of professional contacts to help people navigate bureaucratic obstacles that were preventing them from accessing services they were entitled to receive. Isabella had established what she called Documentation Central in the community center's computer room, systematically cross-referencing neighborhood stories with public records of municipal services and assistance programs. Her research was revealing that Roberto's community help had been connecting families with legitimate programs that existed but were poorly publicized or difficult to access. Every family Roberto helped was eligible for the assistance they received, she announced during an evening gathering that had grown to include neighbors from 3 surrounding blocks. The problem was that eligibility requirements were so complicated and application processes so bureaucratic that people couldn't access programs designed to help them. The discovery shifted the moral framework of their investigation. Roberto hadn't been distributing stolen municipal funds to random community members. He had been serving as an informal social services navigator, helping eligible families overcome bureaucratic barriers that were preventing them from accessing assistance they had legal rights to receive. But the investigation had also revealed the scope of actual municipal fraud that Roberto had been documenting. Construction contracts worth millions of dollars had been awarded to companies that performed minimal work while billing for complete projects. Materials purchased with city funds were being resold for private profit. Municipal equipment was being used for private construction jobs that generated income for individual contractors rather than community benefit. Roberto's community assistance was like a drop of water in an ocean of theft, Cole observed, reviewing financial records that showed the true scale of municipal corruption. The people who were really stealing money didn't want attention drawn to contracting irregularities, even if that attention came from someone who was trying to help families. Jericho's law enforcement contacts had confirmed what the community investigation was discovering. Roberto had been building a comprehensive case against municipal corruption, but he had been doing it carefully, methodically, and with attention to protecting the families he was helping from potential legal complications. Detective Martinez says Roberto had been in communication with federal investigators for almost 2 years, Jericho reported during a planning session that Evan attended while working on an art project about community helpers. He wasn't acting alone. He was serving as a community liaison for a larger investigation into municipal contracting fraud. The revelation explained why Roberto's death had triggered interest from federal investigators and why local officials had been pressuring Maribel about tax records and property assessments. Roberto's documentation of municipal fraud was evidence in a federal case, and his community assistance work was proof that stolen municipal funds could have been providing legitimate community services if they hadn't been diverted for private profit. Marcus had organized the teenage volunteers from the community center into what he called a neighborhood watch for paperwork, systematically photographing incomplete municipal projects and documenting evidence of contractors billing for work that hadn't been performed. Their youthful energy and comfort with technology made them effective at gathering evidence that would support Roberto's documentation. "Look at this," Marcus announced, showing photographs of a storm drain project that had been marked as complete 6 months earlier, but remained obviously unfinished. According to city records, this project cost $40,000 and was finished in September, but you can see that the drainage pipes were never connected and the concrete work was never completed. The evidence was mounting that Roberto had been a whistleblower rather than a criminal, and that his community assistance had been an attempt to provide legitimate services that municipal fraud was preventing from reaching their intended recipients. As evening settled over the neighborhood, porch lights began flickering on in patterns that had become familiar over the past week. The informal neighborhood watch had developed its own rhythms and signals, creating a network of mutual protection that would survive long after Roberto's case was resolved. "Dad would like seeing everyone taking care of each other," Evan observed as his mother tucked him into bed, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess about adult situations. Maribel kissed her son's forehead, grateful for his resilience and proud of the community that had embraced their family during a crisis that could have left them isolated and vulnerable. The brass keychain sat on Evan's bedside table, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a symbol of the father who had tried to balance justice and protection, even when those two goals seemed to conflict. Chapter 6. The black sedan returned on a Tuesday morning, parking with deliberate visibility across from the community center during the hours when mothers dropped children off for after-school programs and elderly residents attended their weekly social gatherings. This time, the occupant made no attempt to remain invisible, stepping out of the vehicle with the confident movements of someone who intended to be seen and recognized. Evan noticed the car first, pointing it out to his mother as they walked to the center for his art therapy session. "That's the same car that was watching our house," he said, with the observational skills that children develop when they learn to monitor adult behavior for signs of safety or danger. Maribel's hand tightened protectively on her son's shoulder, but she continued walking toward the center with determined normalcy. The week had taught her that showing fear might protect her son from immediate worry, but wouldn't solve the underlying problems that were drawing unwanted attention to their family. "Just remember what we practiced," she whispered to Evan as they approached the center's entrance. "If anyone asks you questions about Dad or about our family, you tell them to talk to the grown-ups who are helping us." The intimidation had evolved beyond simple surveillance. Phone calls to neighbors now included specific details about immigration status, government assistance eligibility, and employment situations that suggested someone was conducting detailed background investigations on families connected to Roberto's community assistance work. Mrs. Chen received a call informing her that her daughter's medical assistance was being reviewed for compliance with federal guidelines. The Hernandez family was told that their citizenship application might face additional scrutiny if they continued participating in unofficial community organizations. "They're not threatening us directly," Cole observed during an emergency planning session that took place in Jericho's garage to avoid the possibility of electronic surveillance. They're threatening the people Roberto helped, making sure we understand that pursuing this investigation will hurt vulnerable families. The strategy was sophisticated and effective. Every family that Roberto had assisted faced potential complications. If his activities were classified as criminal conspiracy, children might lose access to school nutrition programs, families might lose housing assistance, and individuals with immigration concerns might face deportation proceedings. It's designed to make us choose between protecting Roberto's reputation and protecting living people who need ongoing assistance, Isabella observed with the analytical clarity that academic training had given her for understanding complex social dynamics. But Jericho's experience with institutional intimidation had taught him to recognize when pressure tactics indicated weakness rather than strength. If they had solid evidence of criminal activity, they wouldn't need to threaten families to prevent investigation. They'd just arrest people and let the courts sort it out. The community center had become an informal headquarters for what neighbors now understood to be resistance against municipal corruption, rather than simply assistance for one family in crisis. The gathering spaces that had been used for children's programs and senior social activities now hosted evening meetings where residents shared information and coordinated responses to intimidation. Mateo had been working with federal investigators who were building a case against municipal contracting fraud, and his reports provided context that made the intimidation campaign comprehensible as part of a larger criminal defense strategy. Roberto's documentation threatens prosecutions that could put people in federal prison for decades, Mateo explained during a meeting that Evan attended while coloring quietly at a nearby table. The community assistance he provided is evidence that municipal funds could have been helping families if they hadn't been stolen for private profit. The stakes were becoming clearer, but so was the path forward. Roberto's careful documentation had created a legal framework that could protect families while exposing corruption, but only if the community was willing to support federal investigations despite threats and intimidation. Marcus had noticed that the surveillance wasn't limited to official vehicles and uniformed investigators. Teenagers from outside the neighborhood had been observed photographing houses, recording license plate numbers, and asking questions about families that suggested someone was building profiles of community members for purposes that weren't officially acknowledged. It's like they're trying to find something they can use to discredit people before they testify about Roberto's help, Marcus reported with the indignation that young people feel when they encounter adult dishonesty that seems both obvious and unfair. The response to intimidation had been community solidarity rather than individual retreat. Mrs. Santos organized coincidental gatherings on her front porch during times when surveillance was most obvious. Mr. Vega began offering free coffee to anyone who wanted to sit outside his store and observe neighborhood activities. Parents coordinated walking schedules that ensured children were never alone while traveling to and from school. "They're trying to isolate us," Mrs. Rodriguez observed with the understanding that comes from decades of community organizing experience. "Make us feel like we're risking everything by supporting each other." But isolation is what allows corruption to continue unchallenged. As evening approached, Evan helped his mother prepare dinner with the careful attention to routine that children use to create stability during uncertain times. The brass keychain had been moved to the kitchen windowsill, where it caught afternoon sunlight and reminded them daily of Roberto's complicated legacy. "Are the bad guys going to keep trying to scare us?" Evan asked with the directness that children use when they need honest information to feel secure. Maribel considered her words carefully, knowing that her son needed truth, but also needed hope. Sometimes when people are doing wrong things, they try to scare people who might tell the truth about what's happening. But we're not alone, and we're not doing anything wrong by asking for help. The intimidation campaign had succeeded in making the stakes clear to everyone involved, but it had also succeeded in demonstrating the value of community solidarity and the importance of protecting systems that helped vulnerable families survive bureaucratic failures and criminal corruption. Chapter 7. The community center had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that assembled on Thursday evening, as neighbors who had never spoken directly to each other found themselves united by shared concern for families facing investigation and mutual determination to protect Roberto's legacy from being destroyed by people who wanted to bury evidence of their own criminal activities. Isabella had spent 3 days preparing what she called a community defense presentation, organizing Roberto's documentation into a clear narrative that demonstrated his role as a whistleblower rather than a criminal. Her academic training proved valuable for creating presentations that would be comprehensible to federal investigators, while remaining accessible to community members whose formal education hadn't prepared them for legal complexity. Roberto's community assistance work was creating evidence. She explained to an audience that included elderly residents taking careful notes, parents balancing children on their laps, and teenagers who had appointed themselves unofficial security for the gathering. Every family he helped was documenting the fact that municipal services could be provided efficiently and effectively if funds weren't being diverted for private profit. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Municipal contracts worth millions of dollars had been awarded for projects that were never completed, materials that were never delivered, and services that were never provided to communities that had been promised infrastructure improvements, social services, and public safety enhancements. But Roberto's documentation revealed more than systematic theft. His records showed that stolen municipal funds could have provided comprehensive assistance to hundreds of families, completed infrastructure projects that would have improved community safety, and supported education and social programs that would have strengthened the entire regional economy. "Your father wasn't just exposing crime," Jericho explained to Evan during a break from the adult presentations. "He was proving that government is supposed to help people, and showing exactly how corruption prevents that from happening." Cole had been working with federal investigators to ensure that families who had received Roberto's assistance would be protected under whistleblower protection provisions, rather than prosecuted as unknowing recipients of fraudulent benefits. His counseling experience had prepared him for navigating bureaucratic systems on behalf of vulnerable populations, and his advocacy was proving effective. 17 families have been granted immunity in exchange for testimony about the assistance they received, he reported with satisfaction that carried undertones of relief. Instead of being penalized for Roberto's help, they're being recognized as witnesses to municipal service failures that federal funds were supposed to address. But the investigation had revealed obstacles that went beyond criminal corruption. Municipal contracting systems were so complex and so poorly supervised that fraud was difficult to detect and easy to disguise as legitimate administrative procedures. Roberto's effectiveness as a whistleblower had come from his insider knowledge of how those systems were supposed to work, and his documentation of how they were actually being manipulated. Mateo's contacts in federal law enforcement had provided information that explained why Roberto's case had generated such intense interest from investigators. Municipal contracting fraud in their region was part of a larger pattern of corruption that extended across state boundaries and involved coordination between local officials, private contractors, and federal program administrators. Roberto's documentation is being used as evidence in prosecutions involving dozens of officials and contractors across 3 states. Mateo reported during a planning session that had grown to include families from neighboring communities who had experienced similar problems with municipal services and official indifference to community needs. The scale of the corruption was staggering, but so was the scope of community impact. Stolen municipal funds had prevented infrastructure improvements, social services, education programs, and public safety enhancements that could have transformed entire regions. Roberto's community assistance had been a tiny fraction of what legitimate government programs should have been providing. As the evening progressed, testimony from community members painted a picture of Roberto as someone who had understood both the potential and the failure of government systems designed to help people. His assistance hadn't been charity. It had been an attempt to provide services that communities deserved and that they were entitled to receive through legitimate programs. Roberto helped my family navigate housing assistance applications that had been stalled in bureaucratic procedures for 8 months, Mrs. Patterson shared with the gathering. Not by giving us money, but by connecting us with social workers who knew how to expedite processing for families with emergency housing needs. The pattern was consistent across all of Roberto's community assistance work. He had been serving as an informal coordinator between families who needed help and legitimate programs that existed but were difficult to access. His insider knowledge of municipal systems had allowed him to identify bureaucratic obstacles and provide navigation assistance that helped eligible families obtain services they had legal rights to receive. The corruption wasn't just stealing money, Isabella observed with growing understanding of the systemic nature of the problems Roberto had been addressing. It was also creating bureaucratic dysfunction that prevented legitimate programs from serving people effectively. Marcus had been documenting current municipal projects using the same methods Roberto had employed to expose contracting fraud. His photographs and records were providing real-time evidence that the problems Roberto had identified were continuing, and that federal intervention was necessary to restore legitimate government services to communities that had been systematically neglected. 3 more projects that were supposed to be completed 6 months ago are still unfinished, Marcus reported, displaying photographs that showed obvious gaps between contracted work and actual construction progress. If Roberto hadn't died, He would be documenting this ongoing fraud and helping more families get the services they need. The gathering concluded with neighbors making commitments to continue Roberto's community assistance work through legitimate channels that would provide transparency and legal protection for families who needed help navigating bureaucratic systems. The brass keychain had become a symbol not just of Roberto's legacy, but of community determination to ensure that government served people rather than enabling private profit from public resources. Roberto would be proud, Maribel told Evan, as they walked home through streets that felt safer because neighbors had committed to looking out for each other. He always said that helping people was everyone's responsibility, not just the government's job. The investigation had evolved from crisis response into community organizing, and the intimidation campaign had backfired by demonstrating the importance of solidarity and mutual support in the face of institutional corruption and official indifference to community needs. Chapter 8. The municipal building's main conference room had never hosted a community forum, quite like the one that convened on a Saturday morning, drawing residents from 6 different neighborhoods who had experienced similar problems with municipal contracting, social services, and official responsiveness to community needs. The room filled beyond its intended capacity, with additional chairs borrowed from other city departments and people standing along walls lined with portraits of former mayors who gazed down with expressions that seemed both authoritative and uncomfortable, given the current circumstances. Evan sat in the front row beside his mother, a small spiral notebook in his lap, for drawing pictures of the important meeting his mother had explained would help people understand the truth about his father's work. Isabella had prepared presentation materials with the thoroughness that academic training provides for organizing complex information into comprehensible narratives. Her charts, timelines, and financial analyses were displayed on easels around the room, creating a visual representation of municipal contracting fraud that made abstract numbers concrete and understandable. Municipal contracting in District 7 shows systematic patterns of overbilling, incomplete work, and payment for services that were never provided, she announced to an audience that included federal investigators, city council members, and journalists whose presence indicated that Roberto's case had generated official attention beyond local administrative procedures. City Manager David Castellanos sat in the third row, with the composed expression of someone accustomed to public scrutiny, but clearly uncomfortable with the detailed financial documentation that Isabella's presentation was making available for public examination. Federal investigators flanked him on either side, taking notes with the methodical precision of people building criminal cases. Jericho approached the microphone with the quiet confidence that community organizing experience provides for addressing official audiences. His testimony focused on Roberto's role as a community liaison, who had been documenting municipal service failures, while attempting to provide assistance to families whose needs were being neglected by bureaucratic dysfunction. Roberto Hale wasn't stealing municipal funds, Jericho stated with clear conviction. He was documenting how municipal funds were being stolen, and trying to ensure that at least some community benefit resulted from programs that were supposed to be helping people. The testimony that followed painted a comprehensive picture of Roberto's community assistance as systematic advocacy rather than random charity. Mrs. Rodriguez described how Roberto had helped her navigate disability assistance applications that had been stalled in bureaucratic procedures for over a year. The Hernandez family explained how Roberto's guidance had helped them access legal immigration assistance that they had been entitled to receive but hadn't known how to obtain. Every family Roberto helped was eligible for the assistance they received, Cole testified, his counseling experience lending authority to his analysis of Roberto's community work. The problem was that eligibility requirements were so complex and application procedures so bureaucratic that people couldn't access services they had legal rights to receive. Evan listened to adults describing his father with words like advocate and community organizer that gave him new ways to understand the man who had been simply Dad in his personal experience. The brass keychain rested in his small hands, its weight feeling different now that he understood it as a symbol of his father's commitment to helping people navigate unfair systems. Marcus presented photographic evidence of municipal projects that remained incomplete months after contracted completion dates, his youth lending credibility to documentation that might have seemed biased if presented by adults who had personal connections to Roberto's case. His systematic approach to evidence gathering had produced a visual record of ongoing municipal contracting fraud that supported Roberto's earlier documentation. These projects were supposed to be finished 6 months ago, Marcus explained, displaying before and after photographs that showed minimal progress on infrastructure improvements that had been fully paid for with municipal funds. People are still waiting for services they were promised, while contractors have been paid for work they didn't complete. The climax of the forum came when Matteo read from correspondence between Roberto and federal investigators that revealed the scope and sophistication of the whistleblower case that Roberto had been building over several years. His community assistance work had been coordinated with federal investigations as a method of documenting how stolen municipal funds could have been providing legitimate community services. Roberto Hale was serving as a community liaison for a federal investigation into municipal contracting fraud, Matteo announced, his words carrying the authority of someone who had been working directly with law enforcement agencies. His assistance to local families was creating evidence that municipal programs could work effectively if they weren't being manipulated for private profit. The revelation shifted the entire context of Roberto's activities, from potential criminal conspiracy to legitimate law enforcement cooperation. Families who had received his assistance weren't unknowing recipients of stolen funds. They were witnesses to how government programs should function when they're administered honestly and effectively. City Manager Castellanos requested permission to respond to the community testimony, his composure showing signs of strain as the scope of documented fraud became clear to everyone in the room. His statement focused on administrative procedures and regulatory compliance, but avoided direct response to specific allegations of contracting irregularities and fund diversions. Municipal contracting follows established procedures designed to ensure accountability and transparency, he said, his words carrying the careful precision of someone whose legal counsel had advised extreme caution in public statements. Any irregularities identified through proper investigative procedures will be addressed through appropriate administrative and legal channels. The response satisfied no one, and convinced few people that existing administrative procedures were adequate for addressing the scale of fraud that community investigation had documented. Federal investigators exchanged glances that suggested Castellanos' statement was being evaluated as evidence of official attempts to minimize and deflect rather than address criminal activity. As the forum concluded, community members who had attended as witnesses to Roberto's assistance work found themselves committed to continuing his advocacy through newly established neighborhood organizations that would provide transparency and legal protection for future community assistance efforts. Chapter 9. Monday morning brought news that transformed the entire landscape of Roberto's case and the community's long struggle for justice. City Manager David Castellanos had submitted his resignation effective immediately, citing personal reasons that fooled no one who had witnessed the previous Saturday's community forum and the federal investigators' obvious interest in municipal contracting procedures. The announcement arrived through local news reports rather than official city communications, suggesting that Castellanos' departure had been sudden and probably involuntary. Federal investigators had spent Sunday interviewing municipal employees and reviewing financial records with the methodical thoroughness that indicated criminal charges were being prepared. They found what Roberto wanted them to find, Isabella observed with satisfaction during an impromptu gathering at the community center, her laptop displaying news articles that described a comprehensive federal investigation into municipal contracting fraud that would likely result in prosecutions extending far beyond their local community. The unraveling was swift once it began. Contractors who had been billing for incomplete work suddenly became cooperative with federal investigators when faced with conspiracy charges and asset forfeiture procedures. Bank records that had been hidden behind corporate structures were subpoenaed and revealed patterns of kickbacks and profit sharing that involved dozens of individuals across multiple municipal departments. 8 arrests were made this morning, Jericho reported, consulting text messages from his law enforcement contacts who were providing updates as the federal operation proceeded, including 3 city council members and 5 contractors who had been systematically overbilling for work they never completed. The scale of the fraud was even larger than Roberto's documentation had suggested. Municipal contracts worth millions of dollars had been awarded through bidding processes that were rigged to favor companies that shared profits with city officials. Equipment purchased with public funds had been resold for private profit. Federal grant money intended for community development had been diverted into private accounts through shell companies and fraudulent invoicing. But more important than the criminal prosecutions was the restoration of legitimate municipal services that began immediately after federal intervention. Infrastructure projects that had been stalled for years were suddenly completed within weeks. Social service programs that had been under review for months began processing applications and providing assistance to families who had been waiting for help that should have been available through existing programs. Mrs. Chen's daughter was approved for medical assistance that had been pending for 8 months, Mateo reported with quiet satisfaction. The Hernandez family's citizenship application was expedited and approved after being stalled in bureaucratic procedures for 2 years. The transformation extended beyond individual cases to systematic improvements in municipal responsiveness and efficiency. Neighborhood requests for infrastructure repairs that had been ignored for years began receiving prompt attention. Community development funds that had existed on paper but never reached intended recipients were suddenly available for legitimate projects that would benefit entire neighborhoods. Evan experienced the changes in ways that 9-year-old perspectives make concrete and immediate. The playground equipment at his school was repaired and updated. The pothole on their street that had threatened car tires for months was filled and properly paved. The community center received new computers and educational materials that federal grant money was supposed to have provided years earlier. "It's like the whole city started working better," he observed during a family dinner that felt more relaxed than any meal they had shared since the investigation began. Marcus had continued documenting municipal projects with the same systematic approach he had used to support Roberto's whistleblower case. His photographs now showed rapid completion of infrastructure improvements that demonstrated how efficiently municipal services could function when funds weren't being diverted for private profit. 3 major projects were completed this week that had been under construction for over a year, he announced during a community meeting that had evolved from crisis response into celebration of systemic change. People are getting services they were promised and deserved all along. The personal vindication for Roberto's legacy was profound, but also bittersweet. Federal investigators had officially classified his community assistance work as legitimate law enforcement cooperation, clearing his name and protecting families who had received his help from any legal complications. But the recognition came too late for Roberto to witness the community transformation that his careful documentation had made possible. Roberto would have loved seeing everyone working together like this, Maribel told the gathering that had assembled to celebrate both federal prosecutions and restored community services. He always said that government was supposed to help people, and that communities had to make sure that actually happened. The brass keychain had found a permanent place in the community center's display case, positioned beside photographs of completed infrastructure projects and testimonials from families whose lives had been improved through legitimate social service programs that were finally functioning as intended. Mrs. Santos had been elected to serve on the newly established Community Oversight Committee that would monitor municipal contracting and ensure transparency in future city operations. Her decades of neighborhood knowledge and her commitment to protecting vulnerable families made her an effective advocate for accountability and responsive government. Roberto's investigation proved that communities can fight corruption when people work together and refuse to be intimidated, she observed during a planning meeting for ongoing oversight activities. But it also proved that government can work for people when officials are honest and programs are administered fairly. The transformation was so comprehensive that it sometimes seemed too good to be true. But federal oversight and community monitoring were providing ongoing accountability that would prevent future corruption and ensure sustainable improvements in municipal services. Chapter 10. 6 months after the federal arrests, the empty lot behind the community center had been transformed into Roberto Hale Memorial Garden, a space where vegetables grew in raised beds tended by neighborhood families and children, played on equipment purchased with municipal funds that were finally reaching their intended destinations. Evan knelt beside a row of tomato plants, carefully watering seedlings while his mother worked nearby with Mrs. Rodriguez on herbs that would be shared among families throughout the growing season. The garden had become a symbol of community cooperation and legitimate government support for neighborhood improvement projects. "Dad would have liked this," Evan said, examining a tiny tomato that was beginning to form on a plant he had helped transfer from the community center's greenhouse. He always said growing things takes patience. But good things happen when people take care of each other. The memorial garden represented more than agricultural cooperation. Federal grant money that had been restored to legitimate community development was funding educational programs, job training initiatives, and small business support that were providing opportunities Roberto had tried to create through his informal assistance network. Isabella had been offered a paid internship with the federal task force investigating municipal corruption, her research skills and community connections making her valuable for ongoing oversight efforts that extended across multiple regions. Her academic work had evolved from theoretical study to practical application of legal advocacy and community organizing principles. Roberto's documentation is being used as a model for community-based fraud detection, she reported during a celebration dinner that filled the community center's main room with families who had gathered to honor Roberto's legacy and commit to continuing his work through legitimate channels. Jericho had accepted appointment as community liaison for the newly restructured municipal government, a position created specifically to ensure that neighborhood concerns would receive prompt official attention and that bureaucratic obstacles wouldn't prevent eligible families from accessing available services. The difference between now and before is transparency, he explained to a gathering that included children who would grow up with expectations that government should serve communities rather than enrich individuals. When everyone can see how money is spent and how decisions are made, it's much harder for corruption to take root. Cole had been promoted to Director of Community Advocacy, overseeing programs that provided navigation assistance for families dealing with bureaucratic systems that remained complex, but were no longer deliberately obstructed by officials seeking private profit from public dysfunction. Roberto's approach is now official policy, he announced with satisfaction during a ceremony dedicating playground equipment that federal funds had purchased after years of being diverted into private accounts. Community liaison services that help families access programs they're entitled to receive. Marcus had received a scholarship for journalism studies, his documentation of municipal fraud having demonstrated aptitude for investigative work that would serve broader social justice goals. His photographs of Roberto's case had been featured in national media coverage of federal efforts to address municipal corruption across multiple states. Roberto taught me that taking pictures of problems isn't enough, Marcus reflected during a youth leadership workshop that was drawing teenagers from communities throughout the region. You have to document problems in ways that help people solve them. Mateo had established a nonprofit organization providing advocacy and assistance to communities dealing with municipal corruption and bureaucratic dysfunction. His experience with Roberto's case had prepared him for addressing systemic problems that affected vulnerable populations across economic and social boundaries. Roberto's legacy isn't just about catching criminals, Mateo observed during a training session for community organizers who were replicating Roberto's approaches in their own neighborhoods. It's about proving that communities can demand accountability and effectiveness from government systems that are supposed to serve people. The brass keychain sat in its honored place in the community center's memorial display, surrounded by photographs of completed infrastructure projects, testimonials from families who had received assistance through legitimate programs, and letters of appreciation from other communities that had used Roberto's documentation methods to address their own municipal corruption problems. Mrs. Santos had been elected to the city council. Her campaign focused on transparency and community responsiveness that would prevent future corruption while ensuring that municipal services reached intended recipients efficiently and effectively. Her election represented community determination to maintain oversight and accountability in local government. Roberto showed us that ordinary people can make extraordinary changes when they refuse to accept injustice and work together to demand better, she said during her victory celebration, which took place in the memorial garden that had become a gathering space for ongoing community organizing and mutual support activities as evening settled over the garden. Solar lights illuminated pathways between vegetable plots and children's play areas, creating a warm glow that extended the day's activities into comfortable social time for families who had learned to rely on each other for both assistance and advocacy. Evan helped his mother pack herbs and vegetables into baskets that would be distributed to elderly residents and families with young children, continuing Roberto's commitment to ensuring that everyone in the community had access to resources that supported health and dignity. People keep saying Dad was a hero, Evan observed as they finished their garden work, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that children use when they're processing adult concepts. But I think he was just someone who couldn't stand seeing people hurt when he could help them. Maribel smiled at her son's understanding, knowing that Roberto would have preferred being remembered as a neighbor rather than a hero, and that the community garden represented exactly the kind of legacy he would have chosen: practical, ongoing, and focused on creating opportunities for people to help each other. The memorial garden had become a symbol of transformation that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhood, demonstrating how community organization and federal oversight could work together to ensure that government served people rather than enabling private profit from public resources. Have you ever witnessed your community come together to fight injustice and create lasting change? Sometimes the smallest acts of courage can spark the most powerful transformations when neighbors decide to protect each other. Would you like another story?